I'm building this round coffee table that has drawers in it, and that means that the drawers are curved. So while I was building this, I figured that this might be a technique that people want some more information about, so I figured I'd make a standalone video on this topic. But just a fair warning, this was my first time ever doing this, so this is not a how-to video. This is more like a learn along with me video. So let's get into it. The first step is to make bending forms, and to do this I need two bits of information. I need to know the outer radius of the curve and the inner radius of the inside of the draw. The outer radius is determined by how big the table is. Mine is 46 inches in diameter, which means that it's a 23-inch radius, so that's easy to figure out. Now the inner curve is based on how thick the draw front is going to be. The way that I'm constructing these draws, there's going to be an inner draw front where all the joinery is going to be done on, and then an outer draw face that's going to be attached after the fact. And each one of those is about 3/4 inches thick, so that's 1.5 inches. So I take my radius, which is 23, and I subtract 1.5 inches, and I get 21.5. So now that I know my outer radius and my inner radius, it's very easy to make bending forms using a circle cutting jig with a router. But I have a shaper origin, so I used that instead, and I only needed to use it to cut out one set of the inner and outer curves. The rest will be done the same way as if you didn't have an origin. The draw fronts are 6 inches tall, so I need to make my bending form at least that thickness. I did that by tracing my perfectly cut shapes onto more MDF and rough cutting the shapes at the bandsaw. Next up, all those pieces need to match the radius exactly. So layer by layer, I built up both sides of the bending form. I used glue and some brads to hold each layer together, and I'm actually not sure that glue is necessary. Maybe screws would be better, but whatever. Then I used a flush trim bit to make the second layer perfect. At this point, it's just rinse and repeat, layer by layer, until I had these huge, heavy bending forms and prepared them for a glue up by adding some packing tape to the insides. This will prevent the draw fronts from sticking to them. All right, so the plywood I'm using is called bendable plywood, and it's specifically made for this type of stuff, but it's really not so easy to find. So I had some leftover from the curved plywood chair project that I did. Some other options would be to use very thin plywood, but I'm not sure the max radius you can get from those. And you can also glue up thin hardwood veneers. There's always options. I decided to use a glue with an extended working time because I thought this would take me a while, but it really wasn't that bad.
All right, it's easier than I thought it was gonna be. Cool.
I let these set up overnight, and boom, I have curved draw fronts. Remember, there's the inner front and the outer face in the same glue up. I repeated the same thing for the second set of draw fronts and moved on to the veneer. If you're brave enough, you can attempt the veneer at the same time as the glue up while it's in the bending form, but I wasn't that brave this time. I decided to go with contact cement as the adhesive here, since I'm using that for the main part of the table as well. So you just roll it on both parts, wait for it to dry, then apply the veneer using a scraper. I let those set up overnight and moved on to cleaning them up. The ideal tool to do this would be a jointer, but I don't have one, so I'll have to do a workaround. There are no straight edges for me to use as a guide with a fence, so I tried my best to cut a straight line down one side of all the pieces. Now, that cut I made was nowhere near perfect, but it was good enough for me to use as a reference along the fence of the table saw to clean up the opposite edge. But I'm not cutting them to their final height yet. I still need to flip the board and use that freshly squared up cut as a reference to cut off the wonky bandsaw cut. Now, finally, flip it one last time and use that freshly cut side as a reference when cutting to final height. No jointer, no problem. The inner draw fronts are going to be about 1.5 inches shorter than the outer draw face, which I cut using the same process. Moving on to the draw boxes. I ripped some 1/2 inch Baltic birch to the same height as the inner draw fronts I cut earlier for the sides and back, then cut the sides to length using a stop block at the crosscut sled. Then I could get an accurate measurement for the draw front using the draw slides I'm going to use. The curved front is going to get a rabbet cut on the ends to hold the sides. So the length of the front needs to be the distance from a slide to slide, which you can measure or just line the front on and mark with a pencil. But how to cut those curved parts? I could use the bending form as a platform to hold the curved pieces, but it's pretty heavy and cumbersome. So I'll make a new jig. I used the bending form to route 2 more curved pieces and marked a center line on them. Then I just tacked both halves to a plywood base and added spacers of the same width along the top for added support. Much lighter. The bending form would have been really hard to push on the crosscut sled. I lined the piece up with the center line, made the cut, then flip the piece over, making sure to line it up with the center line again and cut again. And after about 3 tries of nibbling away at the sides, I got a perfect fit. Now for the rabbets. I'll use the actual thickness of the draw sides and transfer that measurement to the newly cut edge of the front and marked a line for the depth of the rabbet. And that's what I need to cut away. To cut these, I'll use the curved jig again. The first step is to dial in the height of the cut, which will determine the depth of the rabbet. Making sure to keep the board's center line lined up with the jig center line, I moved both the jig and the board to make the test cut on the end and kept raising the blade until the cut is at my marked line. Cool. Now, it's just a matter of making repetitive cuts until I get to the line which indicates the plywood side thickness. When making these cuts, it's important to keep the center lines lined up and move both the jig and the board together to keep the cut flat and square at the top. Once I got to the end line and made sure that it was the thickness of the plywood sides, I transferred the jig's center line on my crosscut sled in case anything shifts around. And I moved on to the other ends where I'm only going to make 1 cut for now, since I know that the jig is in the perfect position for the thickness of the plywood sides. Only after making those initial cuts can I move the board and the jig to clear out the rest of the cut. Obviously, if I had a dado blade, this would be much easier. Alas, my saw's arbor is too short to hold one. This way takes a bit longer, but as you can see, perfect fit. So it gets the job done. Moving on, the back of the draw box will be placed in dados cut on the sides. To get a perfect fitting dado, I like to use my kerf maker. Place the kerf maker on one side against the stop block, make the cut, flip the kerf maker on the other side, make another cut, now clear out the waste in the middle. Again, dado blade would be quicker, but as you can see, this way works just as well. While I cut the dados on the rest of the draw slides, I want to tell you about a special offer from this week's sponsor, Audible. Audible is the leading provider of spoken word entertainment all in one place. At Audible, you can find the largest selection of audiobooks ranging from bestsellers and new releases to celebrity memoirs, languages, business, motivation, and more. Audible has it all. Whatever you're into, I bet you can find a title that interests you. I happen to be really into music, so I love the Words Plus music series. The latest one that I listen to is I Am Mine by Eddie Vedder, and if you're a Pearl Jam fan, run to listen to this title. The stories behind the songs were so interesting, and the exclusive acoustic performances between stories were amazing, and you can't listen to them anywhere but Audible. Listening to these titles that incorporate music along with stories really helps time go by as you're doing something tedious like sanding. So with an Audible membership, you can choose 1 title a month that's yours to keep forever. That includes bestsellers and new releases, and you also get full access to Audible's streaming library, like the Plus catalog or podcasts, original content that's not available anywhere else. Now, for the special offer. You can always try Audible free for 30 days, but right now, for a limited time, you can save 60% on your first 3 months of Audible. That's only $5.95 a month. So give yourself a gift this holiday season and visit audible.com/Tamar or text Tamar to 500-500. Thanks, Audible. All right, dados are cut. Now I can get an accurate measurement for the length of the back, which I cut using the stop block on the crosscut slide. Again, took 2 tries to get a perfect fit here. So for the draw bottom, I used a slot cutting bit at the router table on all the sides, which can ride along the fence because the pieces are straight. The front curved pieces are done just as easily, except this time the pieces are just riding on the bearing of the bit instead of the fence. For the bottom, I normally like to use 1/4 inch plywood, but all I have is this 1/2 inch Baltic birch, so I'll have to make this work. I ripped it so it was slightly smaller than the distance between the 2 grooves that I just cut, and used the front as a guide to rough cut out the curve. Then, using the bending form with a flush trim bit, I matched the curve exactly. The grooves I cut on all the pieces to house the bottom are 1/4 inch, but this is 1/2 inch thick material. So I used that same slot cutting bit and just lowered it down until it was cutting a rabbet instead of a slot, and the leftover tongue is 1/4 inch thick to fit in the 1/4 inch groove. I just tested on scrap to dial in the fit before cutting. I'll use glue and screws to hold the draw parts together. I think it's easier and more precise to pre-drill and make countersunk holes at the drill press, so that's what I did, and I moved on to assembling them. I find it's easy to build the draw around the bottom. Just work your way around, gluing each joint, putting the pieces in place. The beauty of going through all the trouble of cutting the joinery is if you cut everything correctly, you don't need any special clamps to make sure it's square or anything. Placing the pieces in the cut joinery will make sure it's square, and all you have to do is secure it. I start by securing the back with some brads, then move on to the front. I tacked it through the front just to prevent it from moving when I secure it better with screws through the sides. I only pre-drilled the sides before, so now using those holes, I could continue the holes into the front piece using tape as a depth guide, making sure I don't blow through the inside of the curve, and lock it down with screws. Draw one, done, on to the next one. Lessons learned on the first attempt. It's easier to assemble it with the draw front down, and lesson learned on the second attempt. Don't put your hand under a piece you're sliding into a dado. I repeated the same process as before and made sure to clean up any glue squeeze out from the inside with a straw before setting it off to dry. I don't want the screws to be showing from the side, so I used a plug cutter to make some plugs, glued them in, and flush cut the excess once dry. All right, so I think that was pretty good for my first attempt at curved draws. There's still a ton of work that needs to be done though. I still need to attach the faces, but that's probably going to be the last step or one of the last steps. I need to attach the slides. These are going to be push to open slides. So there's just some more workaround stuff that I'm going to need to do here that I'll include on the full build video when I finally get around to finishing up this project. So some few things that I may have done differently. Making the rabbets on the end worked out for this project, but there's not a lot of material here, so I had to use very short screws. For this project, I think it's fine since I'm using push to open slides. The pressure is going to be on the ends here because I'm not going to be yanking at the front. So for this, it's fine, but for future projects where I'm going to do regular pull to open slides, I would want a thicker front here. That way I can make a deeper rabbet to use longer screws. Or you could just skip the screws altogether and use dowels, biscuits, dominoes, or whatever, but this is plywood, so I felt comfortable using screws. If you're using hardwood, I would suggest otherwise. So another idea that I thought of while I was doing this was to do miters instead. So I would use the same jig at the table saw, and I would just set the blade to 45 instead of 90 and cut miters off the front, and then cut mating miters onto the sides, and then use dowels, biscuits, screws, whatever to join them. I think that would work out pretty well. Ooh, another idea would be to use a sliding dovetail. So how would that work? So you would make the tenon on the dovetail on the sides here, and then you would use the same jig here at the router table and make the mating slot along here, but then you would probably have to make some sort of like flat dado for the sides to sit in so it sits straight, maybe, I'm not sure, but I think that that's definitely a really cool idea and probably what I would do if I was doing hardwood. And speaking of hardwood, you could just totally forget the whole bending lamination process and you could just start with a thicker piece of wood. Not sure if you can see on there, you could just draw a curve, rough cut it at the bandsaw, and then clean it up in a bunch of different ways. You can go old school and use hand tools, or you can make a curved router sled that follows the curve that you need. So many ways to go about doing this. You may even just want to forget the inside curve altogether. That way you could just do flat joinery on the inside and just focus on the outer curve. There's a billion ways that you could probably do this, and I could go on, but I'll just end right here. So I hope that you guys learned something from this. I know that I definitely did. So thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to WOODCRAFT and Audible for sponsoring this video. I'll see you whenever this project is done.
Oh, what am I doing? Oops.